welcome to this Q&A on the art of letting go. How can leaders delegate effectively? My name is Amy and I'm going to be your host for the next hour. I'm delighted to welcome Vicki Ramsden, Director of Integrity Performance Consultancy. Describing herself as a strategic thinker, she has an extensive experience in improving organisational performance, motivated by the long-term view, good business sense and integrity. So Integrity Performance is a leadership and performance coaching consultancy that uses a coaching approach and it works with leaders and decision makers to identify and address the root cause of persistent and complex problems. So its sole purpose is to guide leaders to achieving their results. I will be asking Victoria some prepared questions today, all designed to give you the answers you've probably been desperate to ask somebody about how to manage and effectively delegate. As I mentioned, there's a chance for you to ask questions throughout the session today through the Zoom chat. I'll be looking at these as they come in. I haven't missed one yet, so I'll kind of keep an eye on that, respond to you as and when, yeah, we'll see what we can do to get you those answers. So let's get started. On to my first question to Victoria. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Amy. Thanks.
So we've got quite a broad question to kick us off with, but really, I guess it's about the value of delegation. So how can delegation help leaders lead more effectively?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll sort of rattle through a few areas first, and then with other questions, I'll expand on some of these points in more detail. And as Amy said, first of all, it is about sort of context specific. So what I hope I'm going to set out here is some sort of general approaches, because delegation is a tool along with other management and leadership tools that you have. But hopefully this will give you a little bit more insight about when to use it appropriately to get the results that you need. And so some of the ways that delegation can help you to lead more effectively, it can save time. That is one of the kind of key drivers for effective delegation, but over the medium to longer term when it's done right. And I'll unpack what I mean by that a bit later, but it's not a quick fix. So you have to use delegation in the right way, in the right time. But it can also develop capability in a specific task or project area for those that are being delegated to. But it can also help develop management and leadership capabilities for those that are doing the delegating. And again, I'll sort of touch on a little bit more about how that kind of benefits the manager or the leader in that scenario. A third one, and I've sort of touched on this in other areas, is about it really improves trust between colleagues. Of course, it's between those that are doing the delegating and the person that are kind of receiving the new tasks, but it's also about the culture of your business, and trust is really a key component of a good culture. So delegating is one of the ways that you can start to build that trust in an organisation, which is perhaps a less obvious benefit for delegation, but a very important one. And then I would argue that delegating can generate better outcomes because it can create opportunities for improvements. It can bring in fresh insight and fresh approaches. Just because someone's more junior doesn't mean that they don't necessarily have a different perspective on something, and they can bring in kind of insight into what otherwise might be a mature approach. And when delegation is done well, this is the final one, when delegation is done really well, it provides better and more quality assurance by separating out the kind of doing from the checking, and that's a really good discipline. And as with some other areas, I'll expand on what I mean by that a little bit later in terms of the value add that providing assurance can mean, and how you can do that as a leader or manager.
Thank you, Victoria. Those last couple is certainly something I hadn't considered. So yeah, they're incredibly compelling. Thank you. So moving on to our second question. Why leaders and managers don't delegate? So what are these barriers that people put up? Why are we not doing it as much as we perhaps should?
Yeah, of course. And there's a few reasons, and some of these maybe less obvious, but they're all perfectly valid. And I speak for myself that I've experienced some of these as well, which I'll talk through. Now, first of all is maybe a really obvious one, which is out of a genuine concern for your team. A manager or a leader may feel that the team is already overloaded, they don't have capacity to take on any new work. And a little bit later, I'll give you some sort of tips around how to navigate that in terms of setting priorities. But it's a very genuine, very valid reason. Secondly, is a belief that it will take longer to explain a task to somebody else when a manager could just do it themselves quickly. And that may be absolutely true in the short term, but the key is it will be true in the short term. It's not necessarily the right approach over a longer period. And then kind of related to that is a sense of, I can do it better than somebody else. And again, that may be very true in the moment, but that approach doesn't then give credit to the fact that we all learn, we all start from somewhere, we all start from a place of ignorance. And actually, as a manager, it's your job to help impart that knowledge and experience onto your team. And then another kind of area is around lack of trust. So, as I talked about before, you may not know what skills and experience your team have, or if they've got the ability to deliver something, simply because you've maybe not worked with them before. They're maybe a new team. You haven't had the opportunity to test these things out with them. It's a perfectly valid reason, and we'll sort of expand on that a little bit later as well. And then this is the penultimate one, and it's perhaps one that we don't always want to admit to ourselves, is a fear of becoming dispensable. By assigning work, to somebody else in your team, there's potentially a risk, albeit a perceived risk, of not retaining some key kind of operational knowledge, particularly in faster moving sectors where maybe kind of knowledge at the sharp end might move on very quickly. And therefore, as a manager or a leader, it's really important in that scenario, if you're kind of becoming aware that that's something that you might be feeling, is really then to understand the benefit of providing that assurance, and that's your value add as a manager. So your value as a manager isn't to do the doing, it is to provide the kind of assurance level. And I'll talk about that a bit later on too. And then the final one is around the fact that we might simply get enjoyment from a task, or there might be some kudos attached to delivering certain things, and therefore there might be a genuine reluctance to let go of something that you might actually derive quite a lot of pleasure from. So I'll talk a little bit about ways to navigate that when we move on through this session.
Thank you so much. My head is hurting from all the nodding I'm doing and recognising those behaviours, as I'm sure a number of people on this call will be as well. Okay, so we're going to move on now to looking at some different ways to delegate in different situations. So what are some of the different ways that people can do this?
I'm going to set out kind of 4 areas, and these are just to sort of help you to think a little bit differently about the types of things that you can delegate. It's not always just a task. So the first one is around making decisions. So you can delegate the decision making to your colleagues. So if I give you a quick example about how that might be and how you might engage with colleagues. So an example could be if you're looking at changing strategic direction, if you're looking at a different approach or a different way of working, that's a really good opportunity to go out to your team and ask them for their input about how that might be for them and what kind of implications that might yield. And this is a really interesting one, because quite often senior leaders, and I do see this as a coach, but also kind of previous backgrounds, will take a decision because they're the most senior without consulting small c or kind of engaging with their teams, which means then that they lack the operational detail to make sure that whatever the decision is then implemented successfully. And it's very different to take a decision than kind of implementing it and making sure that it's been delivered appropriately. So engaging to your team in that way will potentially flush out unintended consequences. Maybe you might understand a problem from a different perspective that might shine a light on a different approach that you haven't considered. So it's really important that even though you might be more senior and you might have more experience, that doesn't mean that you've got the only perspective in the room. So delegating a decision in that way can be really effective. There is a word of caution attached to that, though, is about how you do that effectively. So if you are going to engage with your team around a decision, you need to be really clear what that decision is. So setting the non-negotiables or the parameters of that decision, maybe outlining the decision with a kind of really clear structure or really clear set of questions. And the other word of caution with this one is that you need to be really honest and open to receiving the feedback and acting on the things that you're hearing back from your team. If you're not prepared to act on some of the things that are coming out, then this really wouldn't be the right approach. But if you're genuinely open to suggestions and new ways of working, this can be really, really liberating. And it also has kind of 2 other added benefits in that it enables those that you're working with within your team to understand more about how to run the organisation, which then means that if you are going to implement some changes, the team already understand the why, and that can be really helpful when they're then going on to implement something, particularly if it requires a change for them and their roles. But secondly, it also means that they're more invested in the organisation, and actually then if you then go on through maybe some challenging times, that you've got a team that are really invested in the mission of the organisation because you've had that opportunity to engage with them. So then the second area is maybe the more kind of traditional way of delegating, which is, I call it sort of direct delegations. It's delegating a task. And this can also work well in an outsourcing context. So you don't necessarily just need to think about it in the context of you and your team. You could also outsource something depending on the nature of your business. And this is kind of works well when it's a task that's relatively low risk, or it's a kind of known risk with appropriate contingencies in place, and it's routine and repeatable. And a sort of genuinely good approach to sort of general good management is around reviewing your work and that of your team and considering who can do this better, and is this the best use of my time? And that's a really good way of identifying the sorts of tasks that you can potentially delegate. And so an example might be, you might delegate the day-to-day client management responsibilities to a member of your team so that they deal with sort of day-to-day inquiries or moving a piece of work forwards on a day-to-day basis. But then you might then have a periodic review with that client to say, okay, how are things going? So that would be a really good way of delegating to a more junior colleague. The mistake that's often made in this situation is that a manager will simply allocate the work without taking the time to set out, okay, what is it that's actually really expected? And that's obviously rarely, a good idea. So what you need to do is really make sure then that you've set clear timescales, that you've set the expectation for the output in terms of what you're seeking to achieve, and that's understood, and that your team have got the opportunity to ask questions. And this is kind of embedded within this. It's the point about, really being able to let go, because effective delegation is letting go of the how and empowering your colleagues to think about different approaches for how they can deliver something, provided that you've been really clear on what the outcome is that you're expecting. So give your colleagues some autonomy, but create the framework for them to do it within. And then the third area, two more. The third area is around a complex problem, which might be a kind of new issue that's emerging. You can set up something like a task and finish group, and that where you can delegate the thinking around the problem resolution to different people in the team. So it can work if it's a problem that the business hasn't encountered before, maybe where the root cause of the problem isn't known or is complex. Part of what you can do when you're setting up the task and finish group is to set out that they need to define the problem or define the scope of work and define the problem statement. You can delegate that part of it out as well. So you don't, as a leader, you don't need to come up with all of the solutions all of the time. But again, you need to be really clear in this kind of scenario, defining what's in and out of scope so that the project doesn't become unwieldy. So setting in really kind of clear checkpoints to make sure that the project runs on track is really important. But this can be incredibly liberating. Again, particularly, as I said, if it's a complex problem or a new or emerging problem, this can be a really good way of getting your kind of best brains around the table to unpack a problem. And then the last idea is, is delegating when the outcome is maybe unknown or it's speculative. So an example of this might be if you're working with a client and you've got your kind of core business, but the client comes to you and says, can you do this other thing for me that might be sort of tangential to your core business, but isn't so far a step away that it's not something that you would just refuse to do. So in that kind of scenario, you might want to put out a call of action to your staff and delegate the sort of solution testing out the new approach or a new way of working, and you can do it in that way. The kind of key area with this is that you need to make sure that you don't jeopardize your core business. So if you're running something like this and you're running it as a pilot, you need to make sure that you've given other responsibilities have been delegated away from your team so that they can really focus on this particular piece of work, but not, as I say, not in jeopardizing the core business or the core outcomes that you're already delivering.
Amazing. One of the things that's really jumping out at me is in all of the kind of the benefits of delegating is really improving diversity of thought in all your core business functions, which as we know is incredibly important to not just have groupthink, or or individual views being shouted the loudest. Yeah, it's really coming out. Amazing. Right, moving on now. So can you kind of share a few examples where delegation is not the right approach to take?
Yeah, definitely. And the first one, which I sort of alluded to at the beginning, if you're delivering a business critical outcome or a high risk project, delegation probably isn't the right approach. The reason being that delegation invariably involves testing out new approaches. It involves some learning and development. So it's really not the right time to sort of test out a new approach if you've got a very specific set of requirements or a time frame, or perhaps there's some reputational risk attached to it. And beyond that, learning comes through the process of delegating, not necessarily the outcome that's achieved. And we all know then that the most learning comes when mistakes are made, and that really is the greatest learning. So you want to be building that kind of contingency in when you're delegating something. So if you have got something that's business critical and high risk, delegation probably isn't the right approach. Or do it, but just factor in lots and lots of contingency so that you're building that kind of risk management right from the outset. A second area is, maybe not so applicable to people, but just to sort of set it out, is in a set of circumstances where you might have a specific methodology or a business process that needs to be followed. So examples might be in kind of technical environments, so engineering, construction, health and safety, maybe manufacturing, where certain things have to be delivered following a certain methodology or a sort of quality process. And quite often those quality processes need to be carried out by sort of certified persons. So in those kinds of environments, the act of delegating becomes far less relevant, since there's limited sort of flexibility in testing out new approaches or new activities. And then another area is, this might sound counterintuitive when we're talking about delegation saving time, but actually if you're really, really busy, delegation probably isn't the right way. And I'll sort of tell you what I mean by that. Now, we all have moments in our day, or just in kind of seasons, where we get really, really busy, and thankfully usually those kind of periods pass, and that's fine. If you're busy all the time, then there's probably something else going on. That's probably more of a time management issue than an issue around delegation. And I would suggest then that you need to look at the sort of time management piece first before you look at effective delegation, because for delegation to be appropriate, you really, as a leader and manager, need to be setting up the right sort of supportive environment in order to allow that kind of the contingency that we've talked about, so allowing for that test and learning kind of approach. So if time management is an issue, and you're generally, one of the root causes of time management is that we label important tasks as urgent, and then we treat everything as urgent. And we all know that if everything's urgent, you can't discern the difference between what's a genuine priority. So there's some stuff there that needs to be unpacked. So as I say, whilst delegation is intended to save time, if you're really, really busy, it's probably not the right time to start thinking about delegating. And then one other area is, and I've mentioned this before, but don't delegate away aspects that you really love doing. So some leaders find that the more senior they get in a role, they actually enjoy that part of it less. That they may find that the thing they love most about their role is the kind of hands-on approach. So don't delegate everything, away to the point where you've got no kind of purpose left, or all of the things that you've really enjoyed doing. But that said, you do need to make sure that you're delegating away tasks that are meaningful. So don't just delegate out all the the kind of rubbish, mundane bits. You need to delegate things out that have actually got some kind of purpose, that enable your team to flourish. But it's perfectly okay to retain some of those things that you love doing.
A question around that. In that kind of continuous delegation, at what point does delegation of a task become somebody's job at the end of the day? I know that's bordering on kind of employment law there, but have you got any advice on maybe balancing that well?
Yeah, I think, and you said it there. I mean, the hard line is, again, in the context, you need to be clear that you're not just changing someone's job description. That there is that hard line there. But if you're delegating away an area of responsibility that's within scope of someone's work, it's perfectly fine as a manager. So taking that client management example that I referred to before, particularly in the case where the business is growing maybe, and you're taking on new responsibilities, or if you're a leader and you're becoming more and more senior and you're having to delegate things away, that kind of account management type relationship can be a really good way of delegating, and actually then you just expect that your team would then continue to work, you know, day to day with that client in that scenario. So it's perfectly fine to delegate something away in perpetuity, and that's fine, provided that it's within the kind of remit and expectation of what the original role was intended to do. But that would be perfectly fine in that scenario.
Thank you. Brilliant. Thanks so much. Just a reminder as well, if anybody wants to add in any questions, please do send them to me and I'll put them to Victoria very, very shortly. Right, so next question. So as a leader, how do you ensure a really successful outcome when delegating?
Yeah, no, good. This is a good one. So the first way is, you know, again, I've sort of have touched on this before, but really recognizing that it is more time consuming in the immediate, you know, to short term. You know, we've all encountered those situations where we think it'll just take me 30 minutes, you know, I'll do it myself. So I'm not going to say that delegation doesn't take more time in the short term, because it does, but the quick wins don't necessarily yield the best results sustainably and repeatably, you know, over the long term. So effective delegation really, you know, develops capability in that specific area, but it also nurtures a kind of general capability around how you cultivate trust, where more delegation can happen. So it's almost like the more you delegate, if that makes sense. And that's really important. And just to kind of expand on the kind of the line report relationship between a line manager and their direct report, that the effectiveness of that relationship really all boils down to trust, and that's so important. So delegation is really one of the key ways that you can cultivate that trust, because trust doesn't just happen, you know, automatically. For a line manager, you know, for them, they really want to know that their direct line report not only can do a good job, but that they're going to speak up if they come across a problem, that they're going to raise it in the right way, and that takes time to get that level of trust. But equally, from the line report, they want the trust in their line manager to know that they've got their back and that they won't point the finger of blame if something goes wrong. And that only comes through kind of experiential kind of learning. So that's kind of the first way is really recognizing that. But once you've established that trust, you're in a really solid position to then continue to delegate, and you delegate different tasks of different nature. The next one is about the kind of oversight, you know, quality control role that a manager or a leader plays. And this can also you know, apply if you're working remotely, which was one of the questions that we had. So delegating activity doesn't mean delegating accountability. So as the responsible person, you still need to ensure that the required outcomes are delivered. It's just you're not the ones doing the doing. So that means your role becomes one of monitoring progress and kind of providing assurance. So you really need to think about, in whichever kind of context you're in, what is it that's going to give you the comfort that that activity or that project is on track, and that any unplanned issues are going to be dealt with effectively. So ways that you can do that are things like progress reports, and you can agree the format or the sort of content of those progress reports up front. You can set an agenda for a meeting and ask the kind of papers or reports to be sent, you know, up front, so you've got time to ask questions and fill in any gaps. You can ask for evidence, so thinking about what outputs are going to be delivered, what indicators will you have, and you can ask for evidence that those indicators have been delivered. Things like scheduling in routine checks to discuss progress, or clarifying your availability so that your colleague knows how and when they can access you if they've got things that they need to check in with you. One of the other key areas is really around establishing escalation processes. So knowing like what are the decision points or what are the decision levels when things need to be escalated and are no longer appropriate for the person that you've delegated to deal with. And that's quite a common pitfall. So having some foresight about that and thinking through what those things kind of look like ahead of delegating are really important. And then other things are around identifying kind of key risks and issues that are likely to occur, and then planning how you're going to deal with them, and doing that in advance before you delegate. And then a couple of key ones are around, you know, diarising key dates. Most of us use digital diaries now, so putting in key milestones into your calendar and then sending that invite around to everyone that's involved, and clarifying roles and responsibilities, particularly where there are sort of handoffs between different pieces of work, really understanding what does that handoff or that exchange of information look like. And then one of the other ways is around setting the non-negotiables and clarifying expectations. So depending on what's being delegated, you can be really explicit about the aspects which must be done in a certain way or by a certain time. And so setting those non-negotiables from the start, that could include things like, let's say you're running an event and you've got the venue hire that you need to confirm. You might have a number of delegates and ticket sales that you need to plan. There are going to be certain dates there that are dependent on one another, so you need to agree those dates up front. But then you might say that the kind of content of the program, there might, your team might have free reign on defining what the content is within a kind of specific topic or subject area, so you can delegate away things like that. The key thing with that kind of scenario is that you need to be really clear what work is involved and what other tasks your team is doing, and making sure that you're helping them to identify what things need to be done in what order, or which ones are the priority, so that they're not confused about which things they need to be focusing their time on first. And then another way of ensuring success is around training needs. Now, in an ideal world, we will know what those training needs are up front, and we can have that discussion with a more junior member of the team. Potentially they've not done that piece of work before, so you can establish those training needs up front. But that might not always be the case, which goes back to the other point around you need to build in contingency if you're delegating something for the first time, so that if a training need only kind of manifests during the process of something being delegated, then you can address it in real time. But that's also then, as a manager, looking across your team and looking at who else in the team have I got that knows how to do this, and can you delegate one job, but you might delegate it to 2 different people depending on what the nature of the tasks are that sit underneath that. And then I've got a couple of others. One is around, again, this is more of a sort of general management sort of principle, is around for ensuring success is around being transparent and being fair. So being aware of the different kind of skills and abilities that you've got in your team, but also your own kind of natural inclinations as a manager. Like, we often have go-to people that we will lean on for a particular piece of work because we think they'll deliver a better outcome. And that may be true, but it may also then be that you're putting undue pressure on that client or on that kind of team member without realizing, or that it appears that they're getting a development opportunity that actually could be shared across other members of the team. So really taking that helicopter view and looking across your team and looking at actually who else could do this piece of work. And then I've got just checking a couple of others on this one. This is one which I'm going to try and illuminate around providing assurance and what that means. If I'm all right, I think I'm all right for time, aren't I? So with this one, let me try and expand on one, because I think this is quite a key point that I think people can kind of come unstuck on, is around delegating sort of authority. And as a leader, you need to get comfortable not being in the detail, and you need to get comfortable with who you can lean on that can provide assurance around something without you having to know the sort of technical detail. And the more senior you get, the more you find that you're maybe more removed from the kind of sharp operational detail, and that can feel really uncomfortable as a leader. So the way that you then provide kind of assurance changes, and so this is kind of part of being a good leader and a good manager. So I'm going to give you like a brief case study around this one. So in this scenario, and this is a kind of true scenario, is where an organization that I was working with, they were implementing something called a new contract management framework. It was to do with assuring that they were operating within sort of public sector procurement practices. Now, this new contract management framework had to be approved by the directors, who were the executive leadership team. Now, none of those directors were contract management specialists. You've got, chief people officer, you've got finance director, you've got kind of operations directors. None of them were contract management specialists. Yes, some of them managed their own contracts and had some kind of insight, but they weren't the technical specialists in that area. So in this scenario, what you wouldn't expect is for all of those directors to go away and read up and suddenly become kind of contract management specialists overnight. That's just not feasible. It's just not appropriate. So in this scenario, what they did was bring in the head of contract management to convene a kind of small working group. And what they needed to understand specifically was, with this new contract management framework, does it require a change in process for kind of day-to-day management of contracts? And if it does, is that change in practice kind of material, or is it insignificant? Is it a tweak to a process, or does it require a fundamental shift in practice? Because if it requires a fundamental shift in practice, then that includes then has implications around roles and responsibilities, training and development, communications, engaging with teams to perhaps understand what the implications of that contract management framework would be. There might be financial considerations. There might also be technical kind of system implications in terms of if a process is carried out on a system, does that system need to be changed to carry out the effective process? So they're the questions that the directors needed to know. What they didn't need to know was, what are the thresholds for signing things off? You know, what are the specific details of the processes? They just needed to know kind of how much, how material, so what are the implications? So they're slightly different questions. And so in this scenario, a project team was convened. It had representatives on from legal, finance, HR, learning and development, technology, who then were able to set out what the change in contract management processes actually were. And the way then that they provided assurance was that once the new contract management framework had been kind of developed and created, and another point just to say is that just developing the management framework wasn't the output. The output was how it was then implemented and embedded, and how they could demonstrate the change in practice that had occurred as a result of this new framework being implemented. So the ways that they were able to look for assurance were around, has the training been delivered? If we asked a handful of colleagues about their roles and responsibilities, can they demonstrate that they've understood what the change in practice is? Does the system now allow us to execute the processes? And they were able to bring in a kind of internal audit function to help them to understand that. So that, and I appreciate this is quite a technical example, but I hope it helps you to kind of see the difference between being in the doing and then providing that layer of assurance. And then I've just got just on this one, I've just got a couple of other examples, 3 other examples, very small ones. So the first one is as a leader, being aware of your power dynamic. And this is another really important one that often gets kind of forgotten in a delegating sense, because typically, not always, but typically, you're going to be delegating to someone that's less senior to you. And so you need to be aware of the fact that they might just say yes to something just because you're more senior, even if they feel that they might not be able to do it, they might be overloaded, they might not have capacity or resources or whatever. So in this kind of scenario, what a good leader will do is to say, I'd like to delegate this activity to you, or this task, or whatever it is. How would that be for you? And that's an incredibly empowering statement, because what it does is it demonstrates that you as a leader already have the trust in the person that you're going to delegate. But it also then gives them the opportunity to really think about, okay, what actually do I need to do? How am I going to do this? And that's, again, a really empowering kind of conversation to have with your colleagues. There's a couple of things here that I think again, often sort of pitfalls that can go wrong if you sort of don't do it appropriately. And the trick is to understand that when you do this and you delegate in this way, you're going to potentially get lots of questions about how something needs to be done. You might not get the question straight away. Your colleague might want to go away and reflect and come back. As a leader, it's very easy to get defensive when you're being asked lots of questions. And I say this, from experience, because it can feel like that the person that you're delegating to is challenging you. They're not. It's a really good thing that they're asking questions. It's a really good thing, because it means that they're really thinking about what needs to be done and how it needs to be done. So as a leader, it's about how do you hold that space and support them to identify what the solutions are. And the other kind of pitfall is it's okay not to have the answers as well. Sometimes the answers can't be known. And again, the sort of common pitfall with a leader is that we think we need to know everything. We don't. And the kind of act of delegating is about delegating, again, the sort of thinking to somebody else to help them to kind of cultivate what's the right approach and what's the right solution. And then I think this one came up in one of the questions, is around leading by example. So if you're a leader and you're supporting kind of teams, managers with teams beneath them, it's really great practice to think about, how are you delegating? Are you even delegating? How are you doing it? Can you see, if other colleagues are overloaded, are you modeling what good delegation looks like? And there's a lot that I could unpack here, but probably for another day. But in that kind of scenario, what you need to think about then is, what training and support have managers got on how to delegate? Is there a culture of delegating that already exists, and what might that look like in terms of roles and levels of seniority? And are you clear, are your teams clear on, what's the role of a manager and what's the role of the team that supports them? And really having an understanding of which tasks are taking up the most time and why they're taking up the most time, to really understand what the root causes of that is. And then I've got one final one in this question, which is around, so to ensure success when delegating is around providing feedback. And this applies, in any of the ways that I'm talking about, but essentially, if it's a long piece of work that you're delegating, so maybe a sort of project over a period of time, it's really important to provide that feedback at regular intervals, not just at the end, because feedback will ensure an opportunity to course correct if things are going wrong. We all know it's easier to correct stuff, in the moment than it is to do it retrospectively. But it also means then that as the knowledge and the learning develops of the person that's doing the delegation, they might then bring in fresh approaches that change the way that you're doing things partway through, and that might be perfectly fine. So, but kind of building in that feedback will enable those kind of light bulb moments to happen more effectively. And then providing feedback at the end is also really valuable, because at the end, when the project's been completed or the task has been delivered and the dust has settled, you can then take a really objective assessment about, have the deliverables been delivered in the way that we expected, versus what we anticipated at the beginning. And you can take that more objective kind of comparison at the end. So providing feedback is really, really important. And if you ever want tips on how to do that effectively, again, happy to do that for another day. So that was the last one.
Amazing, thank you, Victoria. On that question around feedback, I know I've had this in the past around, so there's a really quick question about feedback. I'm sure we can do another Q&A on giving feedback constructively, but what is it best to do that in person, on virtually, or is it, we're all in the habit of writing quick emails saying, oh, well done, that was great. But yeah, what's top tip for giving good feedback?
Yeah, no, really good question. And I would say shy away from doing it in writing. I'd say write down what you want to say is fine, but don't just deliver it in writing, because there will always be questions, and it can be really hard to just receive a piece of feedback without understanding the context. So online is fine, face to face, in person if you can do it well, and some of that will depend on logistics, the relationship, the context, all of that kind of thing. But I would really shy away from just doing it in writing. And to give good feedback, and for it to be meaningful, there are sort of two things to do. The one is really thinking about what is it that you're trying to elicit, and you're trying to elicit a change. So being really objective about what that change is. So for example, focus on maybe one or two examples, rather than just a list of everything that's frustrating, because that's just unhelpful. But pick one or two examples and really set out what was the specific situation, what was going on. So describe the behaviour or the activity, and particularly what went well or what didn't go so well, setting out what the impact of whatever that activity was, and then offering a solution or an alternative. So how this was how it was for me, and here's how it could have been better, or here, if it had done this way, it would have made a different we would have got a different result. And so picking a couple of examples to do it that way. And it's perfectly acceptable to do that with an impartial person kind of holding the space as well. That can be a really good way of navigating that. But I think the trick is with feedback, it's best if it's delivered both ways, rather than just one person giving the feedback. So set that out from the outset. But also then it's about the follow-up. So then what is an action that you're both going to commit to undertaking, and then how will you know that that's happened? So then scheduling in that time for follow-up, that would be my kind of couple of rules of thumb for that.
Thank you so much. As I say, I know we could definitely do another 45 minutes on giving constructive feedback. There was a question that came in, but I think it has been covered around delegating tasks when you don't always know the outcome. I think you've alluded to that it really is around communication, setting up parameters, and not, you don't always need to know the answer. We don't always have those answers. Anything you want to add to that before I close?
I think, I think I've said it already, but it is that wider leadership point around the fact that we deal in complex times, and I think sometimes we need to give ourselves grace as leaders and managers that we can't know everything, that things are changing around us all the time. So you don't need to be the expert, and in fact, my sort of definition of a good leader is not about having the answers. It's about how you create the right environment for the right answers to manifest, and that really is the difference between I would say a great leader and just a manager. If we're going to pull hairs and talk about it in that way.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, time has absolutely flown by, so I will wrap up and say a massive thank you, Victoria, for a brilliant session. I've been scribbling down notes, which is not always easy when you're trying to hold the space, interview, and keep an eye on questions, but it's such an important topic, it's worth getting it right. So thank you so much for your expertise. As I mentioned at the start, we'll share around Victoria's details. Do follow up with her. She's also a very engaged and active member of the Chamber, so I'm sure you'll meet at Chamber events as well, but do stay in touch. A massive thank you to Ali Dovey and Sussex Innovation for being our sponsors today. And then just a final few words from me. For those of you that are new to Brighton Chamber, we're a non-profit, independent membership organisation that aims to help businesses, charities and social enterprises in Brighton meet each other, learn from each other and grow, whatever that means to you. If you'd like to find out a bit more about being part of the Chamber and how we could help your organisation, email me back and we will arrange to have a chat, or you can sign up online. It's very quick and easy. You're more than welcome to come to up to 2 Chamber events before we just ask you to join. And also, if you have found today's session useful, please do check out our events calendar, where we have a myriad of different events. Hopefully we'll see you at one of those events soon. Have a great rest of your week. Enjoy the sunshine and see you soon.